On today's World Insight, China and the U.S. still at odds after Chinese President Xi meets a bipartisan group of U.S. senators. We find out what's on the horizon for China-U.S. ties. And Peking University and the Center for Strategic and International Studies conduct scholarly exchanges in Beijing and Washington. Can academic exchanges pave the way for improved bilateral ties?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tianwei. With the latest rounds of face-to-face meetings between officials from the cabinet and also from the parliament, China and the United States, many hope this will be paving the way for the potential of better quality of communications between the two countries. Meanwhile, the quality of scholarly exchanges between the two sides is being ever more appreciated by both countries and societies. So what is the state of China-U.S. relations now, leading up to the year 2024, and what can be done in between? Today, I'm going to have a conversation with two prominent scholars from China and the U.S. Professor Yu Tiejun from Peking University and Scott Kennedy from CSIS. What a pleasure to see both of you.
Great to be here with you.
What do you make of the latest rounds of exchanges between China and the United States when it comes to high level of governments? Scott.
So I think what we've seen from both governments is a recognition that over the last few years, the relationship's been heading in a very dark direction, and economic decoupling and people-to-people estrangement, and that was not a foundation for either society or the world. And both sides, I think, it's the American language, but I think it's true, that decide that they want to build some guardrails and a foundation under the relationship to at least stabilize it, not necessarily lead to a great deal of cooperation, but stabilize things. And I think the series of visits that we've had, several U.S. cabinet secretaries going to China. We had Commerce Minister Wang Wentao visit the U.S., Han Zheng visit New York. There could be additional visits of senior officials, and of course, potentially the top leaders meeting in November on the sidelines of APEC. Those meetings will not solve problems, but you're certainly not going to solve problems if you don't talk to each other. And so I think at least getting to be able to directly explain what your positions are, better understand the motivations and origins of the other side's positions, to look for any inkling of common ground. To me, that holds out the possibility of going from this fragile stabilization to something that might be more enduring. But I still think, I'm still very, very worried about the overall trajectory of the relationship.
Tiejun, what about your assessment of the latest rounds of communications and meetings between the two sides?
Yes, latest rounds of communications, visitings of high-level officials, cabinet members, I think is extremely good for warming up of the bilateral relations. It's a very difficult bilateral relations, as the first and the second largest economy in the world. It's hard to get along with. But so long as we, the top leaders, can communicate with each other, can work together, I think that's should be welcome.
Certainly those should be welcomed. At the same time, though, we are heading toward a year of could be quite a political disturbance. For example, the election year in the United States, the world is watching very closely, and now there are many things happening on the political scene in Washington. Scott, will these interactions between the two sides really pave a way to prepare for all the disturbances, to say the least, for next year?
Well, certainly 2024 will have a lot of drama politically in the United States. My sense actually is that those political races are going to create a lot of noise, but their substantive effect will be relatively minor, particularly in the United States. I think, there are a range of opinions in the United States about China, and even those that have a more skeptical, worried view about China, those are heartfelt worries. Those are positions which are not adopted purely out of political calculation. And I think actually the Republicans and Democrats share a variety of different points of view and concerns. And so the election will be noisy. China will be discussed a lot. But I think America's China policy is primarily born out of analysis of its interests and its position in the world and its desire to protect the rules-based international order. So yes, a lot of noise, but it will be imperative for cooler heads to think clearly about the relationship. And I think the scholarly exchange can only help in that kind of level-headed thinking.
Tiejun, what about that?
Hopefully, the general elections of the United States do not much harm to the bilateral relations. This domestic politics we are watching, but we hope, the China-U.S. relations would not become a target.
But are you prepared for the worst from a scholar's perspective?
Okay, that's why we want to stabilize the bilateral relations nowadays by the people exchange. We want to build up the basis, to the bilateral relations to prepare for the stormy water.
Now I have noticed that both the terminologies and description of logics in this bilateral relations, as well as the rhetorics, of course, between the two sides, are so different and almost going to two different directions. And therefore, many of the terminologies used by both of you even in describing the situation can be debated one by one, and therefore making the conversation ever more difficult and challenging, a real conversation, to listen to each other. Of course, you are very patient in listening to each other, you know each other, and you trust in the quality of communication. But what about in politics?
I understand, the U.S. description of the relationship is about strategic competition. Xi Jinping has emphasized the importance of mutual respect, win-win, and peaceful coexistence. Yes, those descriptions are the same, are quite different. The U.S. primarily puts the blame on China. China puts the blame on the U.S. Actually, I think these are relatively similar echo chambers that actually share a lot in common with each other. I would say the scholarly exchange has helped break through some of those opinions, which are one-sided. I think both sides share a lot of responsibility in the direction of the relationship. You can put more or less blame on one side or the other, but this is a dynamic, interactive relationship that explains why we've gotten there. And I think the visits from members of Congress, from the executive branch officials, from scholars, provide an opportunity to get beyond those very simplistic descriptions, to get and really delve into issues. And then I think that helps reduce some of the misunderstanding. Again, it doesn't necessarily bridge the differences and eliminate them, but it provides a greater context to understand them, and then maybe opportunities to figure out how to manage those differences. I think, broadly speaking, although we do have a deep economic relationship and reasons to cooperate on climate and health, I think the biggest challenges are going to be how we manage those very significant differences going forward. And I think the extensive communication is part of that. It does require patience. It's not easily summarized in a headline, but through programs like yours, I think that's really valuable to get people to listen to the other in a thoughtful way.
Well, thank you for that. I am keen, together with my colleagues, of course, in order to make it happen under the current circumstances. Go to you, Tiejun, the same question.
I think country-to-country relationships, just a human relationship. If I think I can communicate freely and friendly with Scott, I think we can make an effort to try to make the bilateral relations also behave in this way. We can agree with disagree. To accept the diversity and work together to in this turbulent time, to stabilize the world. I think China, the United States plays the most important, maybe irreplaceable nowadays, not only for their own interest but also for the world.
Whether it is the Middle East conflict, the Russian-Ukraine crisis, or it is the use of local currencies by the developing economies, how do you see South-South cooperation and many other things? How do you see the differences of opinions on these global and security issues elsewhere in the world likely to have an impact on the current discussion of this bilateral relations?
China has initiated, the three initiatives: global development initiatives, global security initiatives, global civilization initiatives. Although it's still quite, we need more to implement or to explain this kind of initiatives to the outside world. But I do think China want to stabilize, want to keep stability in the turbulent world. And we need to coordinate and cooperate with the United States, the most powerful country still in the world. If we cannot work together or cannot work well, and I think most of the things around the world, including what you have mentioned, all those things, the economic revival, the climate change, the local, conflict, the Ukraine. Russell conflict and Middle East nowadays ongoing conflict, war actually, and all these things cannot be solved. And even the international organizations like the United Nations can't work well without the coordination between these two countries. So that's why I think why the bilateral relations is so important.
Mr. Kennedy.
Besides the bilateral issues that the U.S. and China face on trade, on security, on human rights, there are bigger issues at stake beyond that. President Biden and others have mentioned it. We have sort of different visions of the international order writ large regarding security institutions, economic regimes, etc. Whether it's about the UN system or other parts of the international order. There's some overlap, but there's also significant differences. And of course, as you mentioned, there are regional hotspots from areas in Asia to the Middle East to elsewhere, where the US and China will make a big difference for the better or for the worse. And our communication with each other, whether it's working together to find solutions or figuring out how to manage our differences to keep problems from getting worse, is going to be critical. Again, regardless of whether we are the best of friends or the most severest of foes, the communication that Professor Yu, our colleagues on both sides are encouraging is about trying to make it so that we can try to reduce the level of misunderstanding, increase our ability to cooperate where we can, and just simply educate our publics and our policy communities as well. I think that's a public service which he and I are both committed to.
You're watching World Insight. Coming up, scholarly exchanges between China and the United States. What is the significance of this academic exchange? Welcome back. Joining us, Yu Tiejun from Peking University and Scott Kennedy from CSIS. Big congratulations to the success of the academic exchanges between Peking University and also many other professors coming from China, and meanwhile, the U.S. Delegation of experts and scholars. You guys made it happen. Your program started earlier in the summer this year, when the atmosphere of the bilateral relations was as unpredictable as one could imagine. Much harsher, shall I say, apparently at least, than what it is today. So what made you to have the guts and also the wisdom to make it happen? Professor Yu.
Yes, Tianwei, as you just mentioned, the China-U.S. relations has not been very good in recent years. That created many difficulties for the bilateral academic exchange, for both sides. So with that in mind, how to do to reduce this kind of barriers to continue and to speed up the scholarly exchange between these two countries, come up to our minds. I think that's our mission for the university scholars and also think tanks to do something to improve the situation.
How did you come up with the idea, Mr. Kennedy, and what was the process like working with your Chinese counterpart, who you have known for decades? Again.
Sure. I mean, this really began in late 2021, when in the middle of the pandemic and when there was absolutely zero travel, talking with Yu Tiejun's colleague, Wang Jisi, about a one-on-one exchange of visits, which he and I undertook in 2022 to break the ice. But really, the measure of success is having a revival of the scholarly communities in both directions, and not only being able to travel, but to do that type of research, which is really important to increase understanding. And so just through discussions back and forth, CSIS and Beida decided to launch this collaboration. We both recruited scholars from both sides who hadn't been able to travel as a result of the pandemic and were worried about travel because of geostrategic anxieties and other types of worries about leaving their own country. And we were able to successfully persuade a top flight group of scholars from both countries, and henceforth had the meeting in Beijing in early July, and just recently here in Washington, D.C. I think the meetings were a huge success.
I remember early in the summer sitting in a beautiful meeting hall, as small as it could be possible because it made people feel very intimate. It was a very impressive building of Peking University, dated back quite some hundreds of years ago. And just sitting there, looking at the faces coming from both sides, a lot of enthusiasm, excitement, but also people, you can tell they are worried about a subject that they have been working so much on, which is studies of each other. So, Scott, when you were there, as the, how shall I say, as the one who led the delegation for the 2 rounds of discussion from the U.S. side, how did you communicate with your colleagues?
It was amazingly, surprisingly easy. As I mentioned, in 2022, we took trips which broke the ice. In July, in the meeting in Beijing, there was no ice to break. It wasn't because Beijing was so hot, which it was. We were all sweating. But it was because we quickly realized that we're part of the same scholarly community, and we face very similar kinds of challenges. And so people say, you travel to China and you don't ever get the truth or differences of opinion. We found lots of that very quickly. Now, of course, this was a fully private conversation, and so people felt comfortable to do that. But it was amazing, and I was just watching in awe of the depth of the interchange. And I think scholars everywhere really yearn for a time when we don't have those outside forces like a global pandemic or geostrategic tensions or political constraints, which really limit the type of work that we want to do, which is explore knowledge, share that with students and the public. And I think people were just so relieved to have been worried and then discovered that there's this community in the other place that really has the same concerns and hopes as you.
Tiejun, I saw the pictures you took together with your colleagues when you were traveling to Washington, D.C. for the latest round of academic exchanges with Scott's colleagues and himself, of course, as well. So what was it like for you to travel to the U.S.? And what was it like to sit there and for a real discussion in the U.S. Capitol, which of course there are many other political things going on in the same city?
Yes, we do have a sense of a community at the second round of meetings held at the beautiful building of CSIS. I think based on the concern of how to proceed, how to promote the academic exchange under the current geostrategic rivalry between, especially between China and the United States. It makes it extremely difficult to do research, especially related to, for instance, for American scholars, China studies, and for Chinese scholars, American studies. I believe both sides actually, the scholars feel a little bit worried when they went to the other countries, crossing the border with the investigation of the border officials. But when we sit there, and after 1.5 days, extensive discussion, and 1.5 days, keynote speech from different branches of the government, I think we did great success in the scholarly exchange.
So if you were having the opportunity talking to officials, drawing policy from both sides about academic and people-to-people exchanges, what would you say, Scott?
First is that these scholarly exchanges, academic exchanges, universities, think tanks, students, university officials, and others are important and in the self-interest of both countries and the rest of the world, not primarily because it will breed peace and agreement and cooperation across the board, but it will increase understanding. And the US and China need to better understand each other, regardless of whether we're friends or foes. And ignorance is just not a good foundation for smart policy, regardless of what that policy is going to be. So that's the most important thing that officials need to understand, is that making life easier for scholars and students is in their country's self-interest. The second is that they can take a couple practical steps. First, just make it easier to travel. Ticket prices are way too high. There are not enough flights. It takes too long to get visas. Some people can't get visas who should get them. And then when you're in the field, you need to be able to do your work. You need to be able to collect data. And you need to be able, and the people that if you are interviewing people, they should not feel afraid that they're talking to you. If you buy books or other types of documents, you should be able to do that. You should be able to feel like you're not under a watchful eye because you're doing something that's suspect. And so I think both governments could do things which reassure the scholarly communities on both sides. I'm most concerned about young people and students. As you know, the number of students from China has dropped dramatically in the United States. It's still extremely high, but it's dropped a lot. And the number of American students on the ground in China is so small. There's no more American students in China than when I was a student in China in the late 80s, 35 years ago. And if you want the US to get along with China, just from China's self-interest, they want to make it as easy as possible for Americans to learn about China, which involves going to China.
Now, over the past few years, your life could become much more quiet, quote unquote, as a result of the cooling down of the relations between the two countries. What do you make of this difference personally? And how are you adjusting and digesting?
China became an easier place to live because it developed. And there was still a great deal of curiosity amongst Chinese, and Americans were amazingly curious about China. And I think that period lasted all the way up through the 2008 Olympics and maybe a year or two beyond that. But over the last decade, I think there's been growing concern amongst Americans and Westerners about China's direction. Also, as China's economy has slowed, and we've had the pandemic concerns that, focusing on business in China, that may not yield a fantastic career. And so I think that there's been a drawing back, and that's concerning. I'm not trying to persuade people that their worries are totally unjustified. There are greater risks, but there's also great rewards in learning about another part of the world, which is critically important, which is very complex, which is not easily summarized in a headline in whether it's the New York Times or the People's Daily, and that there is much to learn, and that there's a huge responsibility for us to take on that challenge. It's a different proposition than before, but it's still attractive to some. And I actually am honored that we still have a lot of people that apply to be interns at CSIS. I encounter lots of graduate students and even undergraduates still curious about China, but it's not the same as it was. And times have changed.
Tiejun?
In the past decade, there's a watershed change, a sea change for the bilateral relations. A lot of factors, works here. Maybe relative powers, anxieties, misperception, misunderstandings, domestic politics, ideological difference, many things. I think they come by together, to make the bilateral relations deteriorate quite quickly. It's very different from, in the 1990s or the early first 10 years of the 21st century. So that's why I think we should attach much more importance on the people-to-people exchange. Actually, the friendship between countries lies in the affinity of the people, right?
Scott Kennedy, Yu Tiejun, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.